If you want to open your Bible and put your bookmark in 1 Thessalonians and then turn over, we'll actually begin in Acts chapter 17 tonight. So the beginning of a new quarter, we are studying Thessalonians, not Timothy, which has been scheduled forever. And you get that, John? Thessalonians? We're on Thessalonians. Thank you, John. So, and some of you are in the Old Testament class. We are not studying Kings tonight in this class, but hopefully Devin will be home this week sometime, and Kings will start Sunday in the back. So we welcome those of you who are in the other class, so you get to have an introduction to Thessalonians before you study Kings, which is getting the cart way ahead of the horse. So at any rate, good to see everybody. Hope you're having a good week this week. Appreciate you being here, starting the new quarter. So new faces in the classes and lots of stuff going on, holiday weekend, all that good stuff. So appreciate you being here this evening. John, Tom, do you mind leading us in a prayer before we get started?
Our Father,
Amen. Thank you, John Tom. All right. There are some books, unless they've all been picked up. There are some class books back there. I'm not going to use them as a study guide, but if you want something to study on your own, there are some back there. And there's also a schedule back there. If you'll pick that up, it will be our general schedule for the class. We probably won't hold to it specifically, but that's what we're going to try to work off of. So essentially, 2 classes per chapter is going to kind of be the schedule. Yeah, John? I'm sorry? Did I put David? Yeah, it should be John. Sorry. Yeah. This is why God extends mercy to the idiots and the imbeciles like myself. So, disregard, just mark out David, Banning, and just put John, okay? And I will have a whole new fresh copy just for John Polk. Mercy, I hope the Lord's more sufferable than you are. Yes, Dennis, what else did I get wrong on there? Yeah, I could, but you know, everybody needs somebody to watch out for them. So thank you, John. Yes, it will be John Banning. But the schedule, which is the bigger part, is essentially the way we're going to try to cover this. So you'll kind of know, if you're gone, where we should be as we move through this particular letter. What I want to do this evening is kind of offer an introduction to this particular study. And we first come into contact with this city and the people that will become the Christians on Paul's second missionary journey. And so if you will remember, he makes the determination to go back and to visit the congregations where he had been on the first journey, and they're going to go back up through Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, those areas in Asia Minor. And Paul's intent is to go up into Bithynia, this is the part where the Holy Spirit discourages him from going here and going there. Paul ends up in Troas. And in Troas, he receives this vision. This is Acts chapter 16. A man from Macedonia saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And so Paul crosses the Aegean Sea, goes to Philippi, and Acts 16, we're familiar with what happens when he gets there. He meets Lydia and meets with these women by the riverside where they pray, converts a couple of folks, and there is a a woman who is possessed by a demon, who has some kind of ability to foretell the future. At least that's the seeming circumstance. She follows Paul and his companions around, proclaiming them to be the great power of God. And they become frustrated with that to the point that Paul finally casts the demon out of her. It would be an interesting discussion to talk about that a little bit. But Paul ends up in prison. So you remember they're in prison. Paul and Silas, they're singing hymns. There's an earthquake. They are released. They have the discussion with the jailer, and he and his household are baptized. And the next morning, the council sends for Paul, and Paul basically says, you guys are in serious trouble because I'm a Roman citizen and you have arrested me and imprisoned me and shackled me. And so they are very kind to Paul at that point. But for obvious reasons, Paul leaves town. And he goes down this main road. If you notice on the map from Philippi, Thessalonica is the next point, goes through as we pick up in chapter 17 in verse 1, Amphipolis and Apollonia. And let's go ahead and read through the first little section here. So we have the circumstances that produce this particular group of Christians. When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. Some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, those who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. And that's our introduction to the church at Thessalonica. Okay? I want you to appreciate a couple of things about this particular place where Paul goes. Matthew, would you hit the next slide, or whoever's attending the slides back there? This is small to y'all, I understand. The red line on this map is a Roman road. It's actually a road that they began construction on it about 146 years before Christ, and it took about 25 years to build, called the Egnatian Way. And it runs from all the way over here in the west, in the east, it says Istanbul, that's the northern end of Asia Minor and Bithynia, and it ran all the way across Thracia, down through Philippi, kind of around the Aegean Sea, all the way across Macedonia to Dyrrhachium, which is the coast on the Adriatic Sea, which was a short trip across to Italy, and then the Appian Way, which you probably heard of, which is the main road that runs across Italy and into Rome, parts of which are still standing. I've actually walked down parts of the Appian Way. And so basically you have a highway from Rome, which is the capital of the world at this point, all the way to Asia Minor. Thessalonica sits right on this road. Thessalonica was an old Macedonian city, dated back in its origins, kind of in its early iterations, all the way back to the days of Alexander the Great's father. And it is named actually after Alexander the Great's stepsister. Her husband was one of the rulers after Alexander the Great's empire was divided into four. And he made the Thessalonica the kind of the capital city of Macedonia and renamed it after her. Her name was Thessalonia. And so that's where the city gets its name. So it's a very, very old city. When the Romans finally defeated the Macedonians after the end of about 3 different wars, they make Thessalonica kind of the capital city of the area. There's an interesting history when, y'all familiar with the story of Julius Caesar and his assassination? Do you get a little of that or no? You remember any of that from English? Et tu, Brute? Do you remember anything besides et tu, Brute, and beware the Ides of March? Caesar was the emperor, and when Caesar was assassinated, there was a division basically between essentially Mark Antony on one side and Octavian or Augustus on the other side. Thessalonica became the capital of Mark Antony and Brutus and their efforts to take over the empire. Octavian eventually won out in that battle, and the Thessalonians kind of switched sides at the end. And Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, who we're introduced to at the birth of Christ, Augustus rewards them and makes them a free city, which means that while they're not a Roman colony, they are treated with all the privileges of the Romans by the Roman Empire. They are allowed their own government, and because of that, they had a very strong allegiance to Rome. And I was trying to think about this today. I'm not sure that we can really appreciate what it would have been like to be a citizen of some of these cities in the Roman era and the Greek era. Our entire culture in America is built on the idea of independence. And even in every city, cities have their own personalities, and yet the whole city, I can't think of a whole city that's just united in much of any kind of cause, much less a political cause, because we're all taught in this country to think for ourselves. But in these cities and in this culture, there are certain cities. Philippi was a very Roman city. It was colonized by Rome. Thessalonica was a Greek city, but because it was a free city, Rome treated Thessalonica with great privilege. And you have to understand why. It's on a seaport. It's got a main road, a highway, kind of like Interstate 10, probably not under as much construction as Interstate 10, but it runs right through there from the east to the west. You can imagine the commerce that would have gone through that particular area. It was very rich in natural resources, mining, water, agriculture, a very strategic place as far as moving armies. And so you can see why Thessalonica would be extremely important. And it's a sizable city, probably 100,000 people. So essentially the size of Beaumont in that day and age, probably, once again, without all the road construction. Okay, so you have this very significant city. Because it's a free city, it's very, very loyal to Rome. And you see this reflected in what happens when Paul goes there, okay? So appreciate that some sources think that as early as Paul's day there was already a cult that would have deified Caesar, that they considered Caesar a god. In fact, one article that I read indicated that they thought that the Thessalonians were in many ways considered the emperor as the patron deity of their city. Okay, and so their loyalty would be very, very strongly attached to Rome. Rome treated them with freedom. They gave their attention to Rome. That's kind of the way the system worked in that day and age. And so you have this very significant city with probably a group kind of identity, and they saw themselves as being exceptionally loyal to Rome and to Caesar. They are also a very religious city. We think of Athens. When Paul went to Athens, you remember, and he preached on Mars Hill. Remember what he started with? As I passed by and beheld your many idols, I perceived that what? Yeah, you're a very religious people. Well, Athens probably didn't have anything on Thessalonica. One of the articles I read identified over 20 different idols that were associated with the city, a couple of different, maybe 3 different very prominent cults. And once again, the argument was that it was a seat of emperor worship, which to me would have been really, really early. We think of emperor worship as not coming along in its full-blown political pressure until maybe Domitian comes along at the end of the 1st century. But apparently, at least the roots of it were already present in Thessalonica, because they owed so much to Rome, and Rome took care of them, they took care of Rome, and that's kind of the way things go. So, very idolatrous, if you can imagine. Because it's very idolatrous, morally, what would you assume about the city? Huh? Somebody said something. Yeah, very, very licentious city. Most idolatry in the Greek and the Roman world, much of the idolatry was associated with some kind of fertility. And fertility gods, the way that you appeased and kind of enacted the god's favor was through sexual activity, of fertility. And so you have sexual immorality, you have probably greed and dishonesty, which is the case anytime you have a commercial center. And remember, we live 2,000 years under the influence of Christianity. It's hard to envision what the world was like before Christ came into it. And the average person, you think of the average person that you do business with in Beaumont. Who was I talking with just a few minutes ago before service with Kenneth about how hard it is to find somebody that will do what they say they will do. Okay, imagine people who've never been exposed to Christianity. And if it's hard to find morality in our culture, what was it like when people did not think of themselves accountable to Yahweh for their morality, for their ethics? And so this is the city that Paul comes into. Politically important, economically important, very idolatrous, probably very wicked. A lot of Jews there. Some proposed that there was a huge Samaritan population. In fact, you'll notice in verse 4, who is it that Paul seems to have the most success with when he teaches there? The Greeks and the leading women. And you notice this several times through the Gospels. I read an interesting proposal as to why that was the case, that apparently, and I don't know where this information comes from, but I know the guy who wrote the article, and he is not one to do something that's not well researched. The argument that he made was that very often what you would see in these large groups of Greek people attaching themselves to Jewish synagogues is that the immorality around them became frustrating. Not everybody who's not godly is immoral. You probably know folks just like I do. They're not necessarily religious people, but they get really frustrated with all the immorality around them. And the argument was made that among the Greeks who saw the folly of idolatry, that Judaism had great appeal to them because there was a strong moral code, because there was a strong social code. It was very attractive to them. Now, the whole Jew-Gentile bias thing was probably somewhat off-putting, but it was not unusual to find people attached to Jewish synagogues that weren't Jews in the Greek world because Judaism attracted them. And when Christianity comes along, they already have some Jewish background, and now you have neither Jew nor Greek or bond or free or male or female, which dissolves all the biases as well. And so you have great success in the Greek world first among the proselytes. And I found that a kind of an interesting argument. I can see that. So this is probably the city that Paul walks into. Okay? This road that runs through it is a significant part of that. Would you hit the next slide, Matthew? I think it's just another version that shows the road that runs all the way across that part of the world from Asia Minor through Greece, and then just a quick jump over to Rome. Okay, go back to the first slide. This is all the slides I have for you, folks. So this is my PowerPoint for the night. No bullet points, so there you go. Relish in it, okay? Matthew was still in shock that I said I'm using PowerPoint tonight. So, okay. So Paul goes into the city, and I want you to notice a couple of things about the reception in Acts 17. These caught my attention. Who is it that opposes Paul and Silas and their teaching after they become successful? Okay, it's the Jews. And what did the Jews do? They did what? They stirred up evil men from the marketplace, which makes me wonder if they weren't hiring some of their dirty work done. And then they get the whole city all riled up. They're telling them something. And they drag them. Notice that they come, somehow or the other they find out Paul is staying at Jason's house. They go to Jason's house. They don't find Paul. Notice that it says they dragged Jason and some of the brethren before the rulers. Okay, now these are Thessalonican residents, but they owe their power to the Romans. Okay, don't forget that connection. And what is the accusation that the Jews make first? No, the first accusation. What do they say? These who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And I don't know how many times I've used that phrase and that observation in a sermon. And today, for the first time, something hit me about that. Where all in the world has Paul been preaching the gospel at this point? Where does he go on the first missionary journey? Do you remember? I should have got that slide. They go from Antioch down to Cyprus. You remember that's where John Mark leaves them. And they go from Cyprus where? Do you remember? They go straight up to Cilicia. And they go up to Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. And Paul is almost killed. And then they turn around and did what? Went straight back through there. And from there, where did they go? Do you remember? See, you're going to have to study your Acts here. Good thing I'm not offering a test. Okay? You miss out on the first 500 years of heaven if you fail this test. Boy, aren't you glad I don't have that kind of power? Do you remember where they went after they come back to the coast? Huh? No, not back to Cyprus. They go back home. They go back. Okay? The journey doesn't extend farther to the west. Are you looking at on the map? Where do they go after they double back? They go back down to Antioch and then overland down to Jerusalem? Yep. Go back to Derbe, back down to the coast. Okay, we're still there. Uh-huh. Okay, that's on the way out. Okay. All right, so they stopped off in Cyprus on the way back. But my point is, they don't go on this map. They don't go to Colossae, Perga, Miletus, Ephesus, Thyatira. They don't go any farther over there. And they certainly don't go across, haven't been to Macedonia, they haven't been to Thessalonica or Philippi or Berea or Corinth or Athens. And yet, what is the accusation that the Jews are making? They've turned the world upside down. Now here's what I get from that. Now I'm just chewing on this all afternoon today because I thought, Oh, what's the old famous golf quote? Oh, what a stupid I am, about the guy that signed the wrong. Larry Plunk's the only guy in the room that we get that reference, okay? A guy signed a wrong scorecard and lost the Masters one year, and they asked him for a comment, and he said, oh, what a stupid I am. And that's kind of the way I got to thinking about this today. Oh, what a stupid I am. The gospel hadn't been all over the world yet. Do you see that? The Jews are making an accusation against Paul and Silas, and they are exaggerating the dog out of it. Now, certainly from Acts chapter 2, we know that other people had gone to places, and probably among the Jews, they were already familiar with this to some degree. Although when Paul gets to Rome years later, they don't know. They don't know anything about any accusations against Paul. They've heard a little bit about the way. What I want you to see is the Jews in Thessalonica exaggerated greatly the threat that Paul was having upon their city. So that's the first accusation. These who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Well, they're in the process of turning the world upside down, but that really hasn't happened yet. And then here's the second observation. Verse 7, what's the second accusation in verse 7 is what? Yeah, they're preaching another king. I believe that the persecution that you see in most of the first century, especially among the Gentiles, that results especially in Revelation, is not religious persecution, it's political persecution. Because what the apostles were preaching was that Caesar wasn't the king, Jesus was the king. And in an empire that was seated, where all power was seated in one man, in Caesar, that was a political threat. And for a Roman city, a free city, to let this go on when there are people in town that are saying, Caesar isn't the ruler, Jesus is the ruler, that's why the accusation becomes effective. Okay, does that make sense to you? I think we just have to appreciate the climate that Paul's going into, especially as he goes into Macedonia and as he gets closer to Rome. You know, you could preach that in Jerusalem. They're probably all going to go, yay, we don't want Caesar as king anyway. But the closer he gets to the heart of the empire, the more the accusations of political insurrection and treason are being leveled at him. And so, what do they do about that? Well, the rulers, the crowd is troubled. The city rulers are troubled. They don't want to be harboring some kind of insurrection in their heart because they are closely connected to Rome. So they don't have Paul and Silas in custody. So they take security. In other words, they fine. Jason has to pay a bail. And I don't know exactly what the security is. Probably, okay, we'll give you so much money and we won't harbor these guys anymore. I think that's probably what's happening. Because immediately, Paul and Silas are sent away. All right? How long were they there? We know they were there at least 3 weeks. Okay? There are a couple of other factors to give some consideration to. If you leave your bookmark there, I ask you to turn to 1 Thessalonians. It's very clear that they weren't there a long time. But we have a couple of hints in places as to possibilities. You'll notice that Paul mentions in, I didn't write the verse down, chapter 2, chapter 2 and verse 9. Remember our brethren, our labor and toil, laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach the gospel. Paul is engaged in his work as a tent maker for part of the time that he is there. That's not the verse that I'm looking for. I'm sorry, I've got it written down. I just got to find where in my notes I've got it written down. No, that is the verse. He's engaged in some kind of manual labor, and so that was what his job was. So he's there long enough that he at least sets up shop to some degree. Also, in the book of Philippians, in chapter 4, Paul mentions that the Philippians had sent support to him in Thessalonica more than once. Now, Philippi and Thessalonica are only about 100 miles apart. And you could make that trip. My understanding is that about 30 miles in a day on a Roman road was kind of the trip you could make. So within 3 days, somebody could be from Philippi to Thessalonica. So if he's there a month, they could have easily sent support more than once. The chances are pretty good he's there a little longer than 3 weeks, but probably not a lot longer than 3 weeks. And what you see happen there is, back again to Acts chapter 17, a great multitude of devout Greeks and leading women join Paul and Silas, and there's no reason to think that just because there is a problem in town that they have forsaken him. But Paul has to leave, and so he leaves. He goes a little farther down the Ignatian Way, goes to Berea. When he's in Berea, you remember the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians. So it looks like he's going to have success there, but then Jews from Thessalonica chase him to Berea and cause an uproar in Berea. So the folks at Berea get him out of town, and he goes to Athens. Okay? Apparently, in Acts chapter 17, Silas and Timothy stay in Berea when Paul goes on to Athens, and he calls for them to come to him. I'm in chapter 17 and verse 15. Receiving the command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. And then you have Paul's incident in Athens with the people at the Areopagus. And then that takes us down to chapter 18. And remember, Paul didn't have great success in Athens. Chapter 18, he goes to Corinth. And we know he's in Corinth for a year and a half. Look at chapter 18 and verse 5. It says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. So at some point, probably while Paul's in Athens, because that's where he asked for Timothy and Silas to meet him, he sends Timothy and Silas back. Why would he send Timothy and Silas back to Berea, Thessalonica, and Philippi? What do all three of those towns have in common as far as Paul's work there? Okay, he was fairly successful. When he leaves, there are Christians there. What else? He gets run out because of opposition, and he's probably only in each one a very short time. So, if you've got new Christians, you've got opposition, and the people that have planted the congregation are only there for a short time, what would be on Paul's mind naturally? Yeah, what's going to happen to all these groups? So he sends Timothy back to Macedonia, back to Thessalonica. Let's leave Acts now and go on back to 1 Thessalonians. And we kind of come to why this letter is written. Okay? The first chapter doesn't give us as much insight into it other than the fact that they continued working after Paul had left. But when you get to chapter 2, Paul mentions in verse 2 that they were shamefully treated in Philippi. He kind of defends himself, which is part of why this letter is written. Verse 9, once again, we didn't even take anything from you. Verse 13, as you go forward, once again, he commends them because they are now suffering as their brethren in Judea had suffered. But look at verse 17. We, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short time in presence, not in heart, endeavored the more eagerly to see your face with great desire. Therefore, we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. Why do you think Paul couldn't go back? He's not that far away. What had happened when they arrested Jason and some of the brethren? They had taken security. And the question is, What did they have to promise to get out of this? And I think probably the answer is, okay, we're not going to let Paul and Silas come back. And Paul considers this Satan getting in the way. I think that's a valid opinion as to why Paul can't go back and check on these brethren. So chapter 3 and verse 1, when we couldn't endure it anymore, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone. So now we're backing up to Paul has gone to Athens, and Timothy and Silas have come to him, but he said, we thought it was better to be left there alone. So verse 2, we sent Timothy, our brother, to come and check on you. Okay? And then when you get down to verse 6, now Timothy has come to us from you. You remember in Acts chapter 18, Silas and Timothy come back to Paul in Corinth. Okay? So this kind of gives us a time frame about how things have gone. All this happens in quick succession. It has created Christians in places where the gospel can thrive because of the circumstances that are there. And the Christians that are in these places, at least we know in Thessalonica, probably Berea as well, we don't know about Philippi, they're being persecuted for their faith, and Paul is very worried about them, and so he sends his workers back to get word, and they bring word to Paul in Corinth, and he writes this letter to them. Okay, that was a long way to go around saying Paul's in Corinth when he writes this letter to the Thessalonians. But if you see what has happened, you can understand why Paul would be so anxious in regards to the letter itself. If you've read through it, there is this sense of concern that runs through the whole thing. It's not a letter that addresses a whole lot of big doctrinal things like we just came out of Hebrews. There's not all these conceptual issues that Paul's trying to argue through. Essentially, he's worried about their faith. He's worried about them not losing their confidence in him, as we'll see in several things that he writes in the letter. He is very concerned about some moral issues. When you get to chapter 4, he starts talking about sexual immorality and starts talking about love of brethren. So he's concerned about division. He's concerned about sexual immorality because that would have been the world they came out of. And he's concerned about them misunderstanding some things about the second coming. And that's probably what most of us associate Thessalonians with as much as anything else, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But I want you to also notice as you get to chapter 5, all of the various admonitions. I mean, it is almost a machine gun of instruction in chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. Recognize those who labor among you. Warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak, be patient with all. No one render evil for evil. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. Don't quench the spirit, don't despise prophecy, test all things, abstain from every form of evil. I mean, Andy Griffith would say that's a mouthful right there. And so it's not that there's no doctrinal teaching in this. It is a letter to new Christians who are on fire, who are doing great work, who are being persecuted. Probably Paul is being subverted in some way. We'll talk about that when we get there. And Paul is worried about them. And so Paul writes this letter. Okay? There are some people that think 2nd Thessalonians came before 1st Thessalonians, but we'll talk about that when we get to 2nd Thessalonians. I think the order's probably right. Okay? And then here's the last thing. As far as the date, it's almost certain that this letter would have been written between 50 to 52 AD, because when Paul is in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, Paul is brought before the proconsul in Corinth, whose name is Gallio. There are historical records that were unearthed in Delphi where Gallio has written letters to the emperor inquiring about some things. These proconsuls were only in power for 2 years at a time. And there is a date on those letters that have been unearthed. So we know that Gallio either was from late 50 to late 52 or 51 to 53. It's dated by ascension of the emperor, okay? And there is some debate closely. But Thessalonians is probably the second letter that Paul wrote. Galatians is probably the first one. Thessalonians is probably the second one. And so now you got a background. So as we study through this, try to remember all that's going on. It's not a really hard letter, but it is very, very powerful in its instruction, its encouragement, and it gives us a real glimpse of some of the things that Paul was facing. Okay? Questions or comments? All right, I know that was fast and furious. If you have questions, make sure and let me know. And we will start Sunday morning on first chapter, and we'll try to kind of follow this schedule, a couple of lessons per chapter. Okay? Thanks, guys. And it's John Banning that's coming, not David Banning.